The military was very efficient. In less than 10 minutes, Lewis arrived at Charles's home with more than 20 fully armed soldiers. The neighbors didn't know what to think. Charles was both the founder and the leader of the Dawn Alliance, and everyone knew that he seemed to have some connection with the army. But they had no idea what kind of connection would lead to the army surrounding his house. After deploying his squad, Lewis went inside. The onlookers were filled with questions. Did Charles commit a crime? I heard that he killed dozens of people a couple of days ago. Maybe it has something to do with that. But those are criminals. Why would the military object? Maybe it's because he made a lot of negative comments about the army? I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. Olivia and the other members of the Alliance were even more worried. Currently, recruitment for the Dawn Alliance was going well, and they had used Charles's growing influence to attract quite a few people. Although they didn't know how many people would stick with them, they had at least formed the nucleus of a force. However, the Alliance was still in an unstable state. If something happened to Charles, or if there was some conflict with the army, then that would be the end of it. If they weren't careful, the entire Alliance could collapse here and now. They hadn't expected the military to send this big a response just for a piece of information. The first thing Lewis noticed when he entered the room was the submachine gun on the floor. He took a deep breath. Looks like the people you took out were pretty well supplied. I wonder how they got past the border. He shook his head. Regardless of any information about medicinal zombie serums, it was worth it for me to take this trip just for the things you seized from those people. As a paranormal, it hadn't been easy for Lewis to take time away from his duties, but the zombie serum was critically important. Charles said, "Actually, what I have here is even more precious than the zombie serum, but I didn't feel comfortable telling you about it over the phone." Lewis was stunned. What could be more important? Charles pointed at a pile of scrap metal and said, "This is the monster that wiped out the group. It's yours to take." He described what he had seen in detail, including the location of the air defense system. Lewis only half listened. His attention was focused on the mechanical tiger. Charles had not overstated its importance. It allowed an ordinary beast to display abilities equal to its superpower possessor. The military needed to learn how this worked and how to counter it. Although the old social order had collapsed, there were still a lot of good people out there who deserved to be protected. The army didn't want anything like this in the hands of criminals. It was time for Charles to advance his plan to send his parents to the military research lab. He wanted to talk about their background and experience in the hopes that the military would not only accept them, but would assign them a higher position within the organization. "When I asked you to come here," he told Lewis, "I said it was about the zombie virus serum. That's actually true. My parents were researchers in this area 20 years ago. They didn't know at the time that it was forbidden, and the company they were working for had lied to them. When they realized what was going on, they left. But now they want to use what they know to help the military." Lewis knew that even after 20 years, Charles's parents could easily still have useful knowledge. So little research had been done in this area that an illegal underground lab could have discovered more than the military currently knew. Lewis smiled at Doug and Susan and said, "Thank you for your desire to serve your country. We would be glad to have you two help us with the research, but in the interest of secrecy, your freedom will have to be limited. I hope you can understand." He believed what Charles was telling him about his parents' background and motives, and because of Charles's previous contributions, even if it turned out he was lying about any of it, they would still keep his parents safe as a favor to him. Charles's parents nodded. His father said, "Yes, we do understand. This kind of information can't be leaked, and in today's world, having a safe place is a good thing. Where would we want to go anyway? People might have valued freedom in the past, but in this new world, staying alive was what mattered." Lewis told Charles, "I'll escort them to the base myself. With my 4th and 6th tier strength, I can protect them from anything. Charles, although their freedom will be restricted, you can visit them at any time." Tier 4 and 6, Charles thought, surprised when he heard this rank. Although the cultivation progress at the beginning of Awakening didn't necessarily represent a person's future ability, Lewis had reached this level in a surprisingly short time. As long as he manages to survive, he should develop into a very powerful person. But in the impending calamity, many people would die, and Lewis had likely been one of those who would have been sacrificed. But because of Charles's appearance, his fate had changed. Although being separated from his parents was hard, Charles knew it was the best way to keep them safe. He also knew that the city was about to be attacked by insects. The more non-combat personnel he needed to protect, the harder it would be. But the laboratory his parents were going to was very secure. The facility was in the middle of the military base, and with the armed presence there, nothing would happen to it. In addition, the zombie virus serum came from there, so everyone there should be heavily protected. The only potential problem Charles could think of was that the army might investigate his parents' backgrounds. But he wasn't too worried. His parents had done everything they thought was right and had clear consciences. And in these perilous times, the military was willing to overlook a lot. The onlookers were stunned when the military treated Mr. and Mrs. Federer like VIPs and ushered them into the armored car. Who are those two people? I heard they're the parents of the leader of the Dawn Alliance. Does he really have a special relationship with the military? They didn't treat Charles so politely, but maybe his parents know some secrets? Maybe they're being taken hostage to control him. The military was more respected than any civilian force. Even Tier 3 or 4 paranormals had no defense against a sniper rifle or other powerful weaponry. The military strength would always be superior. There was also the fact that most of the people in the area owed the army their lives, and they were grateful. The Alliance chiefs who were monitoring Charles had quickly gathered, and the discussion was spirited. Within 10 minutes after his parents had been taken away, the Alliance chiefs came to some conclusions. They were now sure that he had been sent by the military to monitor the civilian organizations. He didn't seem to be interested in power for himself, which was why he had gone out to fight monsters on the first day of expansion. It looked like his purpose was to report on whether these organizations bullied civilians. They decided that as long as they were honest with him, that they didn't have to worry about the continued existence of the Dawn Alliance or their own safety. They even felt they had a strong backer in Charles. Charles didn't care about any of this. He simply felt that since he had contributed to the military, that it was perfectly fine to borrow their influence. After this event, more and more people wanted to join the Dawn Alliance. In their eyes, the Alliance was under the military's protection, and joining it was a way to get that protection for themselves. In any case, they thought they could always leave the Alliance later if they wanted to, so they weren't risking anything by joining. After all, Charles had made it clear they would be free to leave. The day after Mr. and Mrs. Federer were taken away, members of the Summers family came to visit. "Gentlemen, how may I help you?" Charles asked casually. Max beamed at him. "Charles, it's good to see you. After what happened yesterday, your reputation is really growing. So this would be a great time for a recruitment drive. I know you're too busy to focus on that kind of thing, so we're here to offer you some help with it." Max knew that although Charles had little patience for winning people over, he was smart enough to know it was necessary. He still hoped he could use Haley to get Charles on side, even though things hadn't gone to plan. His daughter was a beautiful young woman, so she should be able to win him over quite easily. Determined to further his own interests, he'd come to Charles with a proposal. Charles may not like pursuing power, but Max was sure he wouldn't refuse when others were offering to take care of it for him. Charles waved off Max's offer. "There's no need. The Summers family may have a lot of influence, but I do too. I won't trouble you with my business here." Max's expression didn't change as he said, "Your business is our business. Just say the word and the Summers family's power becomes yours. As long as what you need is not against the law or the good of humanity, then we'll help you in any way we can. After all, we're family." When Charles heard this, his eyes lit up. "Really? You'll do anything I ask you to do?" Max froze for a second. Then he said calmly, "I believe that you're a good man, so you wouldn't ask for anything that would be wrong." Of course, his words gave him a lot of leeway. If Charles really asked for something that would ruin the Summers family's reputation, then he could use this reason to refuse. "Of course not," Charles said firmly. "Do I look like that kind of person? Would I do anything that would harm the people or the Summers family?" Max smiled. "Of course you wouldn't." Since Max had agreed, Charles feigned a worried look and said, "The monsters in the outside world are rampant. It may not even be safe inside the fortress for long. If you and your family would be willing to join me when I go out to deal with the monsters outside the city, that would be a great help. Of course, you'll have my gratitude, but it will also make everyone in the fortress feel like they owe a debt to the Summers family. Your reputation will skyrocket." Max's heart skipped a beat when he heard Charles's request. Only people with mush for brains would go out and hunt powerful zombies for the sake of other people's safety. He knew that Charles went out to hunt medicinal zombies, not for the stability of the fortress, but because he wanted to increase his own strength. But Max would much rather use a safer method to gain power. The best thing was to have a position of authority and send your underlings out to fight. He didn't need to put himself at risk to fight those terrifying monsters. Charles noticed Max had remained silent, and he raised his eyebrows. What? This is a good opportunity to build your reputation. Are you going to pass it up? Max forced a smile. It's a great idea. Good, Charles said quickly. Get a group together and we'll go out. Max's eyes flashed. All right, but I'll need a little time. No hurry. Charles waved a hand at him. I'll go check on the Alliance. Let me know when you're ready. As soon as Max turned around, his expression turned to one of fury. Charles's attitude was obvious. Clearly, he didn't want the Summers family to become too influential. Since Charles was heartless enough to put them at risk, Max had no choice but to use his backup plan. After Max left, Charles went to meet with Olivia and the other 6 Alliance officials. When everyone was gathered, Charles looked around the table. If you have some business to conduct with me, then conduct it. If there's nothing important, let me get back to work. His apparent indifference bothered them. They had expected him to be hungry for power, so the more he acted like he didn't care about anything, the more uneasy they felt. If there was nothing he wanted, then they had no leverage on him. Right now, there are so many people who want to join the Alliance that we're having trouble handling them all, Olivia reported. We've developed some rules and policies, but there are still a few problems that we can't solve. We were hoping you would have some ideas. Charles didn't want to deal with this kind of issue. Come back to me when you have a plan, he said bluntly. If you need me to do something specific, then let me know. Of course, I might not have the time to help you. Olivia frowned. Actually, the biggest problem is that with this huge influx of applicants, we can't tell which ones are truly loyal to the cause and which ones might be spies for other organizations. We don't have time to investigate everybody, but we also don't want to send people away and lose this opportunity. What do you suggest we do? This sounded like an unsolvable problem, but it really wasn't. The Alliance chiefs were only concerned about the loyalty of their direct subordinates, and they could fill those positions with people they knew and trusted. The real reason Olivia had asked this question was to test Charles and see how much control he wanted to exert over the Alliance. Charles looked at her. Our alliance was only established a day ago. It was only 2 days ago that I explained why it needed to be formed so quickly. Have you forgotten already? Everyone looked embarrassed. Although the alliance had only existed for a day, it had been a very long one. They had spent their busy days scheming against each other and using their own methods to recruit their subordinates and set up their offices. Then they had gotten together and discussed how to defeat Charles. But in the midst of all this activity, they had forgotten the most important thing. Charles continued, I know what kind of things all of you have been concerning yourselves with. You're conducting business as usual, but the world has changed. In the past, everything was going on as it always had. Now, everything is upside down. No one knows what will happen tomorrow, but one thing is certain. Our survival depends on food and water. Only strength can guarantee that the food we have in our hands today cannot be snatched away by others tomorrow. Our very lives depend on this. Charles's words stirred all of them. They had thought that Charles was just someone sent by the military to monitor them, and that was why he showed no interest in power. But his words had just reminded them that they could no longer look at this new world with the same old eyes. Charles stood up and walked over to Olivia. You just asked me how to determine a new recruit's loyalty. Let me tell you this. All your rules and regulations are bullshit. Those who are willing to fight alongside us and go out to search for supplies are our brothers. Those who aren't can get lost. We're not gangsters who enjoy bullying others, or bandits who seize other people's supplies. If we're not willing to protect ourselves, then we're simply a waste of resources. Olivia was trembling. She had always thought of herself as a smart person, but Charles's speech had made her realize that wisdom and intelligence were not the same thing. A middle-aged man in a leather jacket asked weakly, But how can we do this? Most people are joining us so they can stay inside the fortress where it's safe. If we really apply this standard, then a lot of people will die. Charles scowled. If they can't fight zombies, then what good are they? The man in the leather jacket was at a loss for words. He could think of a lot of things the Alliance could do with people who wouldn't fight zombies. As just one example, by relying on the advantage of numbers, they could occupy the city and seize all its resources. But that was exactly the kind of thing the military was watching out for. If the Dawn Alliance sent people out to pillage the city, they would be dealt with very quickly. They might not even get a chance to explain. "I know you all still have some doubts," Charles said, his tone icy. "So with my next action, I will prove something to you. The more people there are, the less power they have. No matter how many sheep there are, they are still sheep when a wolf comes to visit." With that, the meeting adjourned. Everyone had a bad feeling about what Charles was up to. But deep down, they shrugged and consoled themselves by thinking it couldn't be that bad. After all, Charles had shown that he had military connections, and the army wouldn't allow one of their own to do something totally out of line. Maybe whatever he was about to do had been planned by the military in the first place. They were concerned, but at the same time, they were looking forward to finding out what he was planning. After Olivia and the others left, Charles got to work. While all of this was going on, a rumor was circulating through the fortress. "Guess what? I heard that the army has started to practice that technique that can turn ordinary people into paranormals." "Well, maybe we should call them warriors now. I heard it was brought here by someone named Kevin Neal. Why are they keeping this quiet?" "I've got no idea. It seems like things are getting worse every day." Word that Kevin was teaching the military a method to make people become warriors began to spread like wildfire. Charles was now widely believed to have connections to the military, and he was starting to be regarded as their representative. The civilians in the fortress weren't happy that the armed forces had a way to turn people into martial artists, but were keeping it to themselves. This was a tremendous blow to the military's prestige. There were monsters roaming the world now, yet the military didn't want civilians to be able to fight? Were they afraid that if the people became powerful enough, they would rise up and try to take control? Some people began to take advantage of the discontent. A man stood on a street corner, speaking passionately to a gathering crowd. "This is the cultivation technique that I learned from Charles. I am not a person who keeps secrets. I will not use these teachings for profit or to build my own army. In these perilous times, we cannot depend on the military to be everywhere and defend everyone. We need to be able to defend ourselves. This technique belongs to all humanity. It belongs to all of us. It must not be used as a tool by some greedy people to further their own ambitions." There were cheers from the audience. "Yes! My thoughts exactly! You're a much better man than Charles." Many of the people who had joined the Dawn Alliance weren't all that loyal to the organization, and saw no reason to keep their new skills secret. As the cultivation techniques began to spread on a larger scale, more and more people began to question both Charles and the military. While this was going on in the fortress, Charles was heading for the Summers family residence, carrying a long box. When he arrived, he walked past the guards and headed directly to where Max sat in his office. Howard and Tyler were also there, and Charles greeted all three men. Charles said to Max, "My men and I are set, and we've chosen a target. We can move as soon as you're ready." Max leaned back in his chair as if everything was under his control. "Charles, are you playing with us? Are you planning something we should know about?" Howard and Tyler looked at Charles, waiting to see what he would say. Charles snorted. "If I remember correctly, you were the ones playing games. I seem to recall your daughter trying to drug me and set me up with a look-alike." When Charles brought that up, their tempers flared. They had thought their plan was perfect, but then Haley had tried to alter it slightly, and Charles had easily seen straight through it. What was even more infuriating was that Charles hadn't even said anything at the time. When he had left, he had acted like everything was fine and that he intended to work with them. Max hadn't realized anything had gone wrong until he had spoken to Haley. "Charles, there is no need for all this unpleasantness," Max said, frowning. "Apologize to us for your behavior and give us control of the Dawn Alliance. That way we'll still be close partners. But if you refuse, then don't blame us for how we will respond." "Oh?" Charles set his long box on the floor. "Are you sure you want to be rude to me?" "Charles, I know your strength is incredible," Max said. "And as they say, might always makes right. I get that. But you don't understand what true strength is." Charles raised an eyebrow. "And you do?" Max waved at the outside world. "A hill of ants can bite an elephant and kill it. and these ants have already grown. Your biggest mistake is that you don't realize the kind of power a united group can produce. You understand even less the strength of a group of people who have become martial artists. The Summers family also had a cultivation technique that they had obtained from Captain Neal some time back. Although the methods were old, they were still usable. The family had two advantages over Charles. The first was Haley's influence, and the second was that they had spread their technique to a core group of their own people much earlier than Charles had. "I see," Charles said. "You're just using my identity as a cover." He looked like he had just realized this. Max snorted. "I don't know if you're playing dumb or not, but it doesn't matter." He continued in a calm tone. "Let me explain a few things to you. If we are dead, then we won't be of any use to the military, and you will lose the advantage of having public opinion on your side. Then, under the wave of anger from the people, you and Captain Neal will be blamed for everything. Any drawbacks of the new cultivation techniques will also be said to be because of you. People don't care about the truth. They simply believe whatever they want to believe. As long as people believe the lies, then those lies are considered to be the truth." "Then why haven't you killed me already?" Charles asked. "Because it's the least efficient way to use you," Max admitted. "If you join with me in placing all the blame on Kevin, then I can brand you as a saint who broke away from the military's control and has every right to challenge them." Max thought his plan was brilliant. Charles was a puppet of the military anyway, so it would just be a different hand controlling the puppet. He had never been a sentimental person. Even though Charles had upset Haley, Max would never let himself be controlled by his emotions. In the interest of furthering his own plans, he could pretend that nothing had happened. And if Charles did eventually need to be killed, then he would make a fine scapegoat. But for the moment, they already had a scapegoat in Kevin. If Charles cooperated, then they would have their golden boy. They could always turn on him later if necessary. "You understand people very well," Charles said, his tone bitter. "I think if I called you an old fox, you would probably take it as a compliment." Max smiled at him. "Yes, I would. So, are you with us? The people already regard you and Kevin as ambitious, greedy people, but we have the ability to make you look like their savior." As he spoke, men were appearing one after another in every corner of the mansion, blocking all of Charles's possible escape routes. They took their places and quietly waited for his answer, knowing that forcing the enemy into a dead end was likely to make them desperate. Max believed that Charles was an intelligent man who wouldn't throw away his life, along with any chance of attaining his goals. Olivia and a group of Dawn Alliance members were watching all of this from a distance. "We're going to go and save our leader," Olivia said. "With more than 20 superpowered people working together, we'll be unstoppable." The newly trained paranormals around her had their doubts, and they rushed to express them. "What happens after we attack? The Dawn Alliance's reputation will be ruined. What's the point of this? Isn't this whole thing Charles's plan? That means that he was expecting this." "We have to have confidence in him," Olivia sighed. Although she knew that a newly established alliance would not have much cohesion, their attitudes were still very troubling. She was beginning to understand what Charles had meant when he said that the alliance really didn't need or want anyone who wasn't prepared to go out and fight on its behalf. The people she had brought with her weren't willing to fight, but she couldn't save Charles by herself. All she could do now was wait and see how Charles would deal with the situation. A crowd was beginning to gather around the villa where the Summers family resided. "I heard that Charles is in there. We have to teach this power-hungry man a lesson. Everyone, follow me," said a charismatic young man. "This way!" They were all people who had just learned the cultivation methods of martial artists. For the first time in their lives, they felt strong and capable, so it only took a little careful encouragement to pull them together and get them moving. Just as they were all about to charge in, a Summers family guard stepped up and began to speak. "We understand everyone's feelings about the leader of the Dawn Alliance," he said. "We really do. But I want to remind you of one important principle, one that our country is based on. Everyone deserves a fair trial. Mr. Federer should be handed over to the military for judgment. They're impartial, and they'll find the truth about him in the Alliance." The crowd booed, and several of them began to shout, clearly angry. "Who would believe that? We don't trust the military anymore. The military has their own techniques. Why won't they teach us to fight? Get out of our way!" In their eyes, The military that had protected them, fought to rescue them from the monsters, and then brought them here for safety, were now monsters themselves. Sitting in his office, Max could hear the shouts from outside. "Do you still think that you can rely on your own strength to solve everything?" he asked Charles. "You have one chance. Join us. If you wait for the crowd out there to rush in, then we won't be able to save you." Charles knew that if the mob attacked, his ability to help these people would be forever ruined. Whether he survived the fight or not, if he fought these civilians, no one would ever trust or follow him again. But he didn't allow the worry to show in his face. "You have a good grasp of human nature, Max, but you don't have a good grasp of the situation." Max tilted his head and looked at him. "Then explain it to me." Of course, he wasn't really interested in what Charles had to say. He's just stalling, he thought, probably to give himself time to think. If I let him talk, then I can prove to him how hopeless things are for him, and he'll give up. "The military is indeed responsible for protecting the people," said Charles. "That's why you attack the military without any scruples. You think that as long as there are enough civilians on your side, then the military won't want to hurt them." He smiled mockingly. "But you've forgotten something very important. Events are moving too quickly, and people can't keep up with the changes in the world." "What are you trying to say?" Max asked. "Do you think you still have a chance to turn the tables here? If you're seen to be against the people, then you're through." "Do you really think you can do anything you want by controlling public opinion?" Charles asked, his voice dripping with scorn. "Do you honestly think you're that good at it? Do you really think that you can regain all those people's loyalty after you attack them?" Max shot back at him. The public's dissatisfaction and anger had been completely controlled by the Summers family. Max didn't believe that Charles could do anything to change public sentiment, no matter how hard he tried. And it didn't matter anyway. Between the mob and the Summers family's paranormals, Charles would never be able to win. Charles smiled. "Here's the bottom line. It's the nature of people to obey the strongest." He bent over and began to open the long box he had brought with him. "No matter how flowery your words are, you can't change human nature. If you have enough strength, then you can change their minds. And even if you can't completely change their minds, then at least you can change their behavior." Max was starting to get a bad feeling. Charles continued. "It might be a little difficult if I was only relying on my own strength." He reached into the box. "You had a good plan, but you overlooked one thing. The military were preoccupied with fighting the monsters outside, and they forgot to remain vigilant about the threats from inside. But I'm different. I don't turn my back on cowards." He pulled an item out of the box, and Max realized it was a military submachine gun. Even though many people had never seen a real gun, just the threat of one was enough to instill fear in them. Despite being paranormals who surpassed the abilities of ordinary people, the fear of guns was still etched into their souls. The bigger question was how Charles had managed to get his hands on a submachine gun. After the apocalypse had begun, extremely strict gun control had been put in place by the military, so it was impressive that a civilian had obtained such a weapon. Even big families with farming backgrounds couldn't own a gun without the army's approval. So, since Charles had taken out his gun in front of a crowd of people, they assumed he must have the consent of the army. When Max saw Charles's gun, he broke out in a cold sweat. "This is just a misunderstanding," he said quickly, holding up his hands. Charles sneered. "I'm not the best person in the world, but even I have my own moral code. I would never stab people in the back, particularly not those who protect us." The fortress had been built under the supervision of the army, and the people inside the fortress had been escorted there from all over the country by soldiers who were risking their lives in the process. It seemed the Summers family intended to use ordinary people to fight against the army, and even Charles couldn't do such a thing. "Of course not," Howard said quickly. "That would be wrong." But as soon as he had finished speaking, he summoned a wind blade and threw it at Charles's submachine gun at lightning speed. He grinned, fully confident in his abilities as a paranormal, and not all disturbed by the sight of Charles's gun. Moments later, the smile slid from his face as the blade stopped less than an inch from the gun, seeming to hit an invisible barrier, and then it disappeared without a trace. "It looks like you made your choice," Charles said. His eyes filled with determination, and he raised the submachine gun and pulled the trigger. A transparent barrier appeared around Howard's body. It was a power that wind types possessed, but it didn't protect him from Charles's bullets, and and he was killed instantly. A wind type should have been able to withstand more than 5 bullets, Charles scoffed. Looks like he hadn't practiced since he awakened. Max began to panic. He hadn't expected the fighting to start so soon, and he'd been caught unprepared and untrained. "I swear this is all just a big misunderstanding," he cried again, hoping to buy some time. A bullet pierced his heart, and for a moment he gaped at his own chest. He had never expected to die in such a way after all he had done to challenge the army. But clearly his strategy had failed, and he would pay the ultimate price. When Charles turned to Tyler, the man hurriedly looked for cover, but he knew he was the next target. When he was only less than half a meter from the villa gate, a bullet hit his head. The sound of the submachine gun echoed around the villa, sending people into a panic. Charles had already reached the third step. Whether it was his reaction speed or his bodily control, his skill far surpassed everyone. Despite never holding a gun before, his fast reactions and good aim meant he was able to hit every target within a wide radius. The air was filled with pleas as everyone begged for their lives. "No! Spare me, please! We're sorry! Please, let us go!" It was true that superpowers were stronger than a gun, but the frequency with which Charles could shoot rendered the paranormals' strength moot. No matter how quickly they dodged, they couldn't escape from the hail of bullets. There also weren't a great number of paranormals present. Including the 3 members of the Summers family, there were only 6. The rest were ordinary fighters who found themselves filled with regret at being manipulated by the Summers family and having provoked Charles. Just as Charles swept down the stairs, the gate came crashing down. "Kill Charles! Kill Charles!" A chanting crowd rushed toward the villa, but the scene in front of them immediately halted their protest and chilled their blood. The villa was littered with corpses, and it looked like hell on earth. Those who couldn't see were confused by the delay, and they began to push the people in front of them. Meanwhile, the panicked people who could see what was going on tried to push their way back. There was confusion and panic as everyone pushed and pulled at each other, many of them being knocked off their feet. Charles stalked toward them, still holding his machine gun. When the crowd saw Charles approaching them, there was pandemonium. None of them would have broken in if they had known the extent of his wrath. They all began to yell at each other. "Let's get out of here! Run! Save me!" The crowd began to shove each other and scream. They were afraid Charles would turn his terrible assault on them, and they were desperate to escape. As they all ran in circles, the sound of the machine gun erupted behind them. It stimulated their instinct to survive, and they all turned and fled. None of them even had the courage to look back. Within moments, the crowd had dispersed, without noticing Charles hadn't shot a single person. The bullets he had fired were only used to scare the crowd, and had been fired harmlessly into the air. Charles watched the retreating crowd, and then he approached Olivia and the others. "Did you see that?" he asked them. "If all the people you recruited are like those people, then don't bother reporting the numbers to me. Such an army would be useless. Quantity isn't everything. You need quality recruits." Olivia and the others looked at Charles in dismay. They had worked hard to build their recruitment numbers, and they couldn't blame the people for running away in the wake of Charles' slaughter. Those were regular people, not soldiers, Olivia thought. What else did he expect them to do when they were in danger? That said, she realized that their so-called recruits were probably likely to throw her into the zombies' path to save themselves. When she considered it, an army of individuals fighting only for themselves wasn't a good army at all. "Wait a moment," she shouted at Charles before he could leave. "Did you get permission from the military for your actions just now?" "Does it matter?" he replied, raising an eyebrow. With that, he returned to his residence. Olivia watched Charles leave, trying to discern how she felt about the situation. "Was there any reason for that?" a middle-aged man asked her, his eyes full of disappointment. Olivia sighed and said, "I don't know, but we can't just rely on getting as many people as possible. We need recruits to fight with us. We need people we can trust. Don't forget that." Just as the team was about to disperse, Olivia suddenly stopped and shouted to them, "If you guys are facing the barrel of a gun, can you keep calm?" They all stopped in their tracks, feeling a little insulted. Alice led Sylvia forward as Charles approached. I thought there'd be a chance for us to show our skills, she complained to him. But we didn't get the chance to do anything except clean up after you. She and Sylvia were the backup. If an enemy's strength exceeded their expectations, then Charles would use the crowd cover to escape while they engaged the enemy. Suddenly, Charles realized he had overlooked something. "Where's Haley?" he asked, looking around. He hadn't seen any of our overzealous fans lurking around, and their absence drew his attention to the fact that she was missing. "Let's get back," he said, quickly. He had arranged protection for Lena and the others, but that plan wasn't perfect. If Haley had done something extreme, then he would make sure she would regret it. When Charles returned to the house, he found more than a dozen bodies lying outside. "This is not good," he exclaimed. He felt a strong sense of unease, and he rushed into the living room. There he found Harper and Blair, who were both injured. The Dark Mage was still present and guarding Harper on Charles's order. Hank and the others had disappeared. "Where's Lena?" Charles demanded. Harper covered the wound on her arm and said, "A group of people came. When I saw they weren't friendly, I killed them all. But I didn't realize they were actually decoys. By the time I did, it was already too late. Even the Dark Mage didn't have time to stop her. Haley was here, and she's taken Lena hostage." Charles had presumed that the strength of the Dark Mage would have no problem encountering any paranormal below Tier 4, so he had no idea how Haley could have outwitted him. "Haley's a paranormal," Harper said. "A wind type. She was so fast. I'm sorry, Charles. I couldn't stop her." At that moment, Haley appeared in the doorway. She was holding a green wind blade to Lena's neck, and she seemed pleased to see Charles. "I'm here to take my revenge on you," she said triumphantly. "You deserve every bit of what's about to happen." "Be careful, Charles," Lena said anxiously. "She's insane." Charles remained calm as he looked at Haley. "What do I have to do to get Lena back?" "There's nothing you can do," she replied. "You humiliated me, and now you have to pay for that. It is a pity your parents have left. I like the idea of having extra hostages." "Cut the crap," Charles said, in no mood to argue with her, "and tell me your terms." Haley pointed at Harper and the others and said, "I want you to kill them. It's either them or your sister." Harper was shocked by Haley's ultimatum. She knew her relationship with Charles wasn't strong. She was only his sister's friend. If he was faced with a choice between her and Lena, then there was no way he would choose to save her. Lena was even more anxious. "If you do that, Charles, I'll never forgive you." Charles took a step forward, causing Haley to instinctively shout, "No, don't move. If you take another step, your sister will die." She was afraid he had some tricks up his sleeve, and she kept her eyes trained on him. "Okay, I'm not moving," he assured her, holding up a hand. Although he seemed cooperative, there was no trace of anxiety in his expression. "Even if I do what you want, how are you planning to escape?" he asked her. "Why should I run?" Haley asked. "After all, I'm here to make you suffer." But her trembling body betrayed her. She was clearly not as confident as she would have him believe. "All right," he said. "But how can you prove my sister will be safe? How can I believe you won't hurt her if I do as you say?" "I can do whatever I want," Haley pointed out. "But if you don't listen to me, then your sister will die." Charles shook his head. "If I follow your instructions, my sister will still die. I don't trust you to keep your word. Why should I kill everyone just to prolong her life for a few minutes? I have no reason to listen to you at all." Haley was stunned. The negotiation wasn't going at all like she had planned. "I didn't expect you to so casually disregard your sister's life," she said, sneering at him. "Of course I care about her life," Charles said, shrugging. "But if you won't guarantee her safety, then I'm not playing whatever game there is." "Just kill her, Charles," Lena begged. "Don't worry about me. If you let her go, then you'll only be dooming more innocent people, and that will make me an accomplice." Charles felt a headache coming on. "You sound just like Mom and Dad," he complained. "That's the kind of thing they would say." "I'm not going to be an accessory to more suffering," she replied stubbornly. Haley clenched her left hand, and the invisible bindings around Lena's body grew tighter. "Isn't it touching that your brother doesn't care about you?" Haley taunted her. "And yet you're still trying to save others." "I'd do anything for my brother," Lena replied. "That's what family does. Wouldn't your family give up everything for you?" Charles immediately knew Lena had said the wrong thing. He held the essence-blocking amulet in his hand and prepared a plan. "Don't talk about my family," Haley shrieked. "They don't care whether I live or die, not as long as they have their family honor. If they thought it would help them achieve their goals, they'd sacrifice me in a second." Lena was stunned, and she felt bad for judging Haley so quickly. "Have you tried talking to them?" Lena asked, blinking her large, sympathetic eyes. Haley was stunned at the suggestion. She could never talk to her parents about feelings. They had taught her everything about being successful and reaching her potential, but they didn't waste time on sentiment. Charles saw his opportunity, and he threw the amulet. "Essence-blocking amulet," he cried. It was an evolved version of the suppression amulet that sealed both a person's movements and the power of thunder. The sealing time depended on the person's strength. Haley panicked. She was running on pure hatred, but she hadn't been trained in combat, so she was at a disadvantage. Charles had left her alone before, but this time, he felt merciless. "No, don't kill her," Lena cried. "She just kidnapped you," Charles exclaimed in frustration. "Do you seriously think I'm going to just let her go?" Lena shook her head, and then she turned to Haley. "I was too afraid to realize it when you were threatening me, but did you ever actually intend to kill me?" "If I'd killed you, then I couldn't have threatened Charles," Haley said. "But when I moved around, you carefully adjusted that green thing in your hand," Lena said, determined to make her point. "You were afraid of hurting me, weren't you?" Charles was stunned. He hadn't noticed that detail. "Yes, all right," Haley cried. "I don't want to kill anyone." Haley saw a vast difference between ordering others to kill and killing people herself. When her subordinates had died, she'd been filled with regret and panic. She had even considered escaping, but she had already passed the point of no return. "Charles might think you're bad, but I don't think killing is in your nature," Lena said. "I think you're just angry and tired, and you want to be free." Haley couldn't hold back her tears. Lena observed her for a moment, and then she said, "I don't know what kind of life you live, but it seems to be quite tragic." Haley was astounded that Lena, a commoner raised by working people, could pity her, a movie star with tens of thousands of fans. She knew that, from an outsider's point of view, it seemed like a joke. But Lena did have a point. After a while, she managed to regain her composure. Charles stared at her, unwilling to break the effects of the essence-blocking amulet. He had seen too much of the negative side of human nature. Although he was sorry for Haley and her pitiful circumstances, she had still taken the opportunity to threaten his family. So, even if Lena hated him for it, he wouldn't let Haley go. Haley looked at Lena. "If you didn't look so much like Charles, I'd never believe you were his sister. How can the same family produce someone so sweet and someone so cynical?" Lena gave her a sad smile. "My brother wasn't always like this," she explained. "I don't know why he changed, but I hope my old brother will come back one day." Haley glanced at Charles. "I was wrong about how to hurt you," she said. "Physical pain won't work. If I really want revenge, then I know what would hurt you most." Charles frowned at her. "Do you think you still have a chance?" He knew Haley couldn't be allowed to escape. If she tried to so much as move, then he would end her life. She no longer had any tricks to play, and he was running out of patience. "I won't know if I don't try," she said cryptically. Then she looked back at Lena. "Today, you are all safe and sound. But if any bad guys want to use you to threaten your brother, then what are you going to do?" Lena thought for 2 seconds and said, "I'd rather die than be used as a bargaining chip." "That's touching," Haley said. "But if you die, then your brother will be sad. Wouldn't you rather not be threatened at all in the future?" Lena's eyes lit up. "Well, yes, of course." Charles felt uneasy. "Haley, what are you doing?" he asked, his expression stony. "Do you think I won't kill you?" She ignored him and said to Lena, "If you become strong, then you won't ever be threatened again. Maybe you can even protect your brother." A green light suddenly appeared around her body and transferred itself to Lena. "The inheritance," Charles cried. Even he was stunned by Haley's actions. He remembered that before Dale had died fighting, he'd given his superpower to Anthony Cranston, making him a necromancer. It seemed that Haley had done the same thing to Lena. But Charles didn't understand why she would do that. He thought she wanted revenge against him, and he couldn't see how doing such a thing would achieve that. Haley collapsed to the floor. Although her expression was serene, there was a trace of relief on her face. From the moment she had been born, her family had seen her merely as a tool to use. She had been trained to be beautiful and charming, but she had always felt like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. Sometimes, she felt like no one really knew who she was, and she was jealous of those who had a better life than she did. Charles kneeled beside her, and she looked up at him. "Your sister is nothing like you," she said. "She cares about you more than she does about herself. She was even willing to sacrifice herself for you. I must admit, I'm quite jealous. Nobody has ever loved me that much." She sighed. "Now she'll no longer need you to protect her. As long as she was by your side, you would have made her as ruthless as you. Maybe now she'll make you a better person instead. Then everyone will win." Passing on the inheritance had drained her soul of energy, and she was exhausted. Her vision began to fade, and her breaths grew shallow. Moments later, she was gone. Charles carried her body out of the house and burned it with hellfire. Lena watched him silently, not trying to stop him. Her worldview had changed, and she had seen her brother in a new light. She was also shocked that Haley had passed her superpowers to her, and she was struggling to adjust to everything that had happened. Charles wanted to comfort her, but he couldn't think of anything to say. After all, he wasn't good with words. He was better at taking action to solve problems, and he wasn't sure how to handle emotional matters. "You have a responsibility now," he told her simply. "Don't waste your power." Despite his shock at the day's events, he knew that the outcome was ultimately good. Since Lena had awakened, she would have a degree of self-protection, which made things easier for him. The other matter he needed to attend to was the military's inevitable interrogation. When Tony Hughes saw Charles, he looked angry. "You've given me a huge problem," he said, scowling at him. "You killed a bunch of people in front of about 100 witnesses. Do you know how many people have come to us demanding we do something about you?" When Charles had annihilated the Azure Dragon Society, there had been evidence that the society had been committing crimes. Besides, none of the witnesses to the actual killing had survived. Others had only seen him go in and then come back out, and they hadn't witnessed what had happened in between. But this latest incident was different. Not only had Charles killed everyone from the Summers family, but he had threatened everyone in the crowd. The military had the monumental task of covering for him. They knew Charles had eradicated a massive potential threat. After all, if the Summers family had continued to lead public opinion, then not only would it be detrimental to the military, but it would have affected the stability of the fortress. But they also couldn't be seen to allow Charles to kill people seemingly at random. Therefore, Tony had come to make Charles agree to a compromise. Charles needed to accept his punishment and give people an explanation for his actions. Faced with Tony's complaints, Charles asked, "How long can you maintain the current situation?" Tony's expression turned serious. "What do you mean?" he asked nervously. Charles took out a map and drew a big circle on it. "This is the area the military has the most control over, right?" he asked. "You guys are going to build an enormous fortress here, aren't you? If there's trouble anywhere, then that's where you'll get the fastest support from." As they listened, the assembled soldiers became more alert, and some of them even put their hands on their guns. "Even I don't have the authority to know what you're talking about," Tony said, his voice frosty. "Look, I know you've contributed a lot to the military, but we can't just let you do whatever you want. You've caused a safety concern for countless people. Please, give me an explanation." Charles pretended not to notice everyone's nervousness. "My subordinates might not be able to fight, but they can gather information," he said. "The military is already building the 4th and 5th fortresses, and they've started moving people there." "What is it you're asking?" Tony frowned. "When will the apocalypse end?" Charles asked him. "Are you joking?" Tony asked, his jaw dropping. "Wake up! You can't possibly think the world will ever return to the way it was." "If it can't be restored, then why are you still holding on to the concepts of the old era?" Charles shouted. "The people in the fortress have nothing to do all day except cause trouble. They just stand around, waiting for you to throw them some compressed biscuits. Do you expect to keep them like that for the rest of their lives? And you want them to raise children like this? Do you think you have that kind of power? Tony flinched, uncomfortable with the turn this conversation had taken. After all, his job was to serve and protect people, not to ask questions above his station. Charles continued, "You think my actions were too much? But is that really true? People want you to deal with me? How do they think you can achieve that? The monsters are getting stronger all the time. How can you protect the law in a place where the laws no longer apply?" "So, what do you expect us to do?" Tony asked, running a hand through his hair. "Trust the safety of the fortress to you?" Charles shrugged and said, "Your higher-up should have already thought about that. I only care whether the people I love are safe. It doesn't matter what I get in return for my contributions. I only want one thing, and that's the safety of my family. I just want to be allowed to defend myself, and the only reason I'm in danger in the first place is because I shared survival techniques with other people." Tony was speechless. The military had no obligation to ensure the safety of the fortress. After all, they had to focus most of their energy on the dangers outside and the people who were waiting for help. Perhaps Charles had gone too far, but he was within his rights to defend himself. How could the military complain when he had given so much to them, the country, and the citizens of the fortress? Tony sighed and said, "Fine. After today, I doubt anyone's going to provoke you anyway. But you should be careful how much of your humanity you're prepared to sacrifice for survival." Then he shouted to his soldiers, "Withdraw!" He didn't want to arrest Charles, and the matter was too complex to do so anyway. He had to consider the relationship between the military and paranormals. If they became enemies, it would create a lot of trouble for the army. Although Charles could appreciate Tony's perspective, he sighed and said, "I hope the military changes faster. Otherwise, there's going to be a disaster." He didn't announce the catastrophe he knew would occur a few days later. First, he couldn't be sure if it would happen this time. Second, even if he told them, it wouldn't make a difference. Most people ignored the impending disasters and dangers around them. In the lead-up to the apocalypse, people had had access to information about the danger via the internet, but they hadn't acted on it, choosing instead to view it merely as entertainment. Tony reported the conversation with Charles to the higher members of the military and waited for a reply. After 10 minutes, they called him back. "Starting tomorrow, everyone will practice martial arts," came the order. "Take people out of the city to fight. Distribute weapons and food to everyone willing to leave the city and fight the monsters." The soldiers in the fortress were shocked at the news. "This will definitely cause chaos," Tony said with a sigh, "but it might allow more people to live."